Hello everyone, my name is Varuni Bhatia and I teach history at Azim Premji University. I have a very special guest with me today, Professor Michel Danino from IIT Gandhinagar. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with him and talking to him today about several things that he has been working on for the last many decades that he has been in India. Professor Danino is a scholar by definition of early India, although he has very many interests that go beyond early India as well. He is the author of several books and articles on the history of India, such as The Lost River, On the Trail of the Saraswati, The Invasion That Never Was, and more recently, a book that I'm also very interested in, Sri Aurobindo and India's Rebirth. He has also authored Indian Culture and India's Future. Apart from authoring several books, Professor Danino has been a long-standing public intellectual in India and a persistent voice of argument and persuasion around taking Indian history, culture, and traditions seriously as the foundational building blocks for our own understanding of our present. He has been associated with the Indian Knowledge Systems project, both at his home institution at IIT Gandhinagar, as well as more broadly speaking. It is now, Indian Knowledge Systems are now an integral aspect of both school and university curriculum in India. And more recently, Professor Danino has been appointed as the head of the Social Science Textbook Revision Committee set up by NCERT. So, very warm welcome to this program, Professor Danino.
Thank you.
And it is indeed a great pleasure to have you here with us at Azim Premji University, Bangalore.
Thank you, Professor Varuni.
I want to begin by asking you something that in the several interviews that I saw of yours, I didn't quite see that question, which is, could you tell us a little bit about your journey to India? I know I'm taking you back several years to a different continent, to a different country, but I am very interested in knowing more, as I'm sure so is our audience, about how you came to India and the crucial role played by Sri Aurobindo in that.
You have given the answer in short. I can make it a bit longer if you wish, but yes, from actually my teen age, I started looking at, the meaning of life, which of course many teenagers try to do in their own clumsy ways, and trying to figure out what it all meant, and not finding satisfactory answers around. And through a set of circumstances, I started stumbling on some voices from India, such as Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and others. And, by the age of 16, 17, I was actually reading Sri Aurobindo fairly seriously and finding that he had the answers to many of the questions I was asking. So then the question, of course, was whether to keep this as a kind of a side interest and then live a normal life, which I could have done. I was following an engineering line in France. But I felt a need to put this more at the core and center of my life. And therefore, I decided that I would spend some time, if not my whole life, in India. And that decision was kind of taken by the age of 17, 18. But it's only at the age of 21 that I managed to come to India, and Auroville in particular, this international township, this experiment, if you like, based on the ideas of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And then a whole, different life and set of circumstances followed, which in fact took me away from Auroville a few years later, but still very much connected to the same purpose and same activities. I went into publishing, editing, translation work for many years, and gradually started my own research, because in fact, my interest in Indian civilization, though I was, as a school-going student, I was quite fascinated with ancient civilizations. Almost outside of the school syllabus, because that was not very fashionable in those days. But I used to read a lot on those topics. But you know, it's usually Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it rarely goes beyond.
Yeah.
So when I read Sri Aurobindo, he, of course, wrote a lot about his own philosophy, his own yoga, his own message for humanity, if I may put it simply. But he also wrote quite a lot about Indian culture, the foundations of it, the specific features of Indian civilization, because as you know, he was in fact a teacher in different places, in Baroda and then later on in Calcutta, and therefore he had also to formulate certain things for himself and sometimes for students. In Calcutta especially, he used to teach almost all topics of what we call today humanities. So then you see his understanding of Indian civilization was of course shaped in the beginning of the 20th century, and I wanted to see what remained of it today, and there were certain historical questions that he dealt with. There were certain, you know, interpretations of Indian texts like the Vedas, for example, etc. And therefore, I started looking at the modern scholarship on all these issues, and slowly got dragged into, dealing with archaeology, with ancient history, meeting scholars, asking questions, participating in events, and gradually, you know, contributing my own little research from time to time and so on. So that's a short answer.
Oh, that's really fascinating to hear. Thank you. There's something that I wanted to tease out of what you just said, that you started reading Sri Aurobindo's writings on several aspects of what one would today call, broadly speaking, the humanities education, because he was himself a teacher. He was speaking with his students in Baroda, in Calcutta, and so on. But at the same time, you suggested that when you started reading on similar topics by later scholars, there must have been something amiss. Did you find something amiss? Was there something that you felt was being missed somewhere in the kind of scholarship? And I'm assuming this is scholarship that was being done in India in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you know, those so-called great decades of, Indian scholarly production. So what was it then that you decided that you needed to study more about it, and where were you going to?
So I could take an example, which is that Sri Aurobindo went very deeply into the meaning of the Vedas, the four Vedas, but more particularly the Rig Veda. And he developed his own quite original, distinct interpretation of them as basically texts which reflected a certain spiritual exploration and discovery and path of discovery, couched in a very deeply symbolic language. And in passing, you have to remember that he was writing in the 1910s. He had in fact taught Sanskrit to himself, basically, very much, though there were some occasional helps. He also taught the Vedas to himself. Basically, he was very much a self-taught Vedic scholar. And then, in passing, he was aware, having in particular studied in Cambridge, of, you know, what was called at that time the Aryan paradigm, the Aryan invasion of India, not just of India, also of Iran and of Europe and so on. The whole Aryan expansion of what in the 19th century was projected as the mighty conquering Aryan race, of course white and so on and so forth. So he was well aware of this paradigm, and he was expecting to find it clearly in the Rig Veda, and he never found it. He found something extremely different. And he explains here and there, but almost as side remarks, though they're very important, that there is an aberration there. There's something which has been imposed on the text, which is not what the text is trying to express. And therefore, again, in passing, it's not his central purpose. He rejects quite unambiguously the Aryan invasion theory and sometimes ridicules it, showing the kind of absurd paradoxes that it leads to. And he's also aware of a certain dissident Western scholarship.
Right.
That actually does not accept this paradigm, or not in full.
Yeah.
For example, does not accept the racial backdrop of it.
Right.
All right. So there are, of course, always all kinds of different nuanced positions and all this. But he discusses it. Finally, if you put all his side remarks together, there's a body of discussion which really is completely what we would call today textual.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what bothers him the most is the injustice done to the text, injustice done to the Veda in bringing it down to a crude warfare between two races, one conquering and smashing the natives and so on. And this is what bothers him. It's not even so much the false narrative, but the fact that we are losing something in the process, something which for him is precious, and which, expands later in the later periods of Indian text and society, of course, the late Vedic period and so on, and which ultimately blossoms into the classical Indian culture, which, of course, he knew very well, and therefore, this is the great paradox that he constantly highlights, that how could such a crude text, crude according to the then European scholarship of it, such primitive, the word primitive comes back constantly in European scholarship of the 19th century. If that text was so crude and primitive, how could it have blossomed into all this high philosophy of the Upanishads and the later schools of thought and so on and so forth? There is a contradiction. And why should the Vedas be so revered as, the ultimate indisputable voice of truth and so on? So when I read all this, and it went a little bit above my head initially, because it's not his easiest work to read. There are far easier works of Sri Aurobindo to. That was also not the first text I read of him. I was fascinated, and I was wondering what is the scholarship on this question today? Right. What do archaeologists say? What do textual, interpreters say? So therefore, I started this journey of exploration of my own, and it was not limited to Indian scholars, though I was privileged to meet quite a few, even then very senior archaeologists. Most of them are no longer with us today, and participate in lots of discussions and events. But I also read a lot of Western scholars, and I found that there were, again, very different opinions.
Right.
There were people who had, like the British anthropologist Edmund Leach, who had been scathing towards the whole Aryan paradigm. But there were also people, both again abroad and in India, who still stuck to the basics of the theory, maybe minus the racial component, though it was still somewhere re-emerging in subtle ways. But the basics of the theory, which is that Indo-European speakers, as they had been renamed in the process, came into India, and they are the ones who brought Sanskrit and who brought the social order and ultimately composed the Vedas and so on and so forth. And they were not, then they were not the native population of India at that time. So I discovered all the different positions, and I have this habit of mine, which I don't know whether it's partly a result of my education in France or just it's part of me, that I really want to see all the shades of opinion, though I may form my own.
Right. Yeah.
And but even if I'm against a school of thought, I want to study it. Right. I don't want to just reject it without studying it.
Yes.
This is in fact one principle I gave to my students at IIT Gandhinagar, because many came from, in postgraduate level, where I gave a course on Indian civilization.
That's right.
Many came with all the stereotypes that can be absorbed in the undergraduate courses. And I used to tell them, if you want to reject something, feel free. But an intelligent way to reject is first to understand what you are rejecting.
Yes.
If you reject without understanding, then you're really wasting your time and your intellectual capacities.
Absolutely.
So this is in fact something I keep telling my students, where I see them, because I teach a course on Indian civilization at the postgraduate level, or till recently at least I used to teach it. And they come with all kinds of stereotypes, a whole baggage that they have absorbed at the undergraduate level. And very often, with negative attitudes towards this or that aspect of Indian culture, society, whatever. And I used to tell them, before you reject something, try to understand it. You're free to reject. There's no imposition on anyone to accept anything. But develop this habit of understanding what you reject and why you want to reject it. Then, it's intelligent rejection.
Right.
Otherwise, you're not doing justice to your own intellectual abilities if you reject something which you don't even know which is what happens most of the time. So therefore, I started exploring certain aspects of Indian culture, civilization. There are lots of very, very interesting discussions in Sri Aurobindo about even the importance of art in India, the importance of aesthetics, the whole attempt to spiritualize many aspects of life. And in that, of course, there is no difference with today's studies, except that they are perhaps more refined in their theoretical models.
Right.
He was writing in the 1990s after reaching Pondicherry, where he took refuge, and he had actually not a single book at his disposal. So everything he wrote in the first, at least the first editions, was just out of him. So it was just, the whole substance of his own journey through India. And it was not attempting to be a scholarly exposition. It was just extracting, the sap, the gist of India and making it alive. Right. So this is where I got interested in, gradually all aspects of Indian civilization, and what today goes by the name of Indian knowledge systems, which we started exploring years back at IIT Gandhinagar in a fairly systematic way. So that's part of my journey, in short.
Thank you. That extremely fascinating, and I loved how you spoke about encouraging your students to engage with all kinds of scholarship that's out there, all kinds of opinions that are out there, and not to reject any single one, because you don't like it, or I fully agree with you. And I think in terms of how we have studied our pasts, we have been stymied, I feel, in certain ways, in the way in which we approach our past, and how we want frameworks to understand the past. And sometimes the past is unwilling to fit itself into frameworks.
Absolutely.
Sometimes I think history is also a framework, and the past is incapable to fit into the framework of history, right? When I'm thinking about pure empiricism, or this Rankian kind of a mode of saying this happened and then this happened, and sometimes things don't fit neatly into this and that happened. So in that regard, what you're saying, your point is very well taken. What I would like to kind of ask you to talk about a little bit more is how do we then think about these Indian knowledge systems? What is the best way to bring them together in a way that we can inculcate a genuine appreciation of some of these things, while at the same time maybe not giving up on some of the critical lenses that has also been cast upon them, right? And whether that may be through these aforementioned frameworks, political economy being one of them, or whatever you want to call them, how do we then encourage people that there is a way to understand things that come to us from our past without necessarily either having to say, this is the best exposition of X, Y, and Z, or having to say, this is worthless, I'm not even going to look at it. So I think you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I would really like to hear more about that.
We have had to confront these questions at ground level, if I may say so. The conceptual level comes after. And the difficulty is this. We have a lot of facts to go by. For example, if you study ancient Indian mathematics or agriculture, where you have texts, you have some archaeological evidence, you have some inscriptions, you have this, you have that, knowing, by the way, that it's only a very small proportion of the total evidence, total documentation that you would actually need. A lot of evidence has disappeared in the course of time. A lot of evidence is lying there somewhere, but still not exploited because there are so few scholars, etc., etc. But my point is that lining up the facts is not enough.
Right.
You can document and you can say, yes, these are the water structures, and this in this state they were built this way and then that way, and in evolution, the evolution in time, and so on and so forth. But then you're just, again, lining up data, whatever data we have. Most of it is non-controversial. Sometimes there are, of course, doubts and questions, and you can also honestly state them. But that's not enough. What is missing is the whole worldview. What is missing is, for example, how did an ancient Indian mathematician, Aryabhata or anyone, think and view this mathematics? And that's something that scholars have pondered on. For example, to pursue this line, it's now well understood that Indian mathematicians saw and developed an approach to mathematics which was extremely different from the Greek approach, for example. If you take, for example, political science, polity, the art of governance, which is Arthashastra, not the text itself, but the whole field. And these shastras precisely are the ancient corresponding unit to what we call now knowledge systems. And I keep saying that the way we can define a knowledge system is just a shastra. If you have a shastra, you have a theory. If you have, for example, Chikitsa Shastra, which is medicine, there's a theory, there's a system, the knowledge is codified, organized, and all that. So that's what we mean, first of all, because not everything is a knowledge system. So what I mean to say is that we have all these texts, but to enter the minds of those who wrote them, who contributed to this knowledge, who codified it, who added to it, who commented on the earlier texts and all that, is extremely difficult. We can't always do it. First of all, you have to be a scholar immersed in those ancient texts. You have to know the languages, you have to know the whole evolution in time, you have to know so many things. So, students or teachers do not have that luxury to spend years, or not even the inclination. So what can be done is basically to extract certain, again, illustrative examples and show what is the difference. What is, knowledge is culture specific. That is the first principle you have to understand. Maybe today mathematics is done pretty much the same all over the world. But that's because, there's been so much of communication. But even in the 19th century, it was not true. And there were still many important differences. And of course, in the ancient world, the differences were huge. For example, the Greeks were very, very concerned about theory, about axioms, and the whole discipline and process of axiomatics. The Indians were not. They were concerned about pragmatism, what worked, how to get very good results fast. And their methods were correct. Their algorithms were correct. And sometimes they went much further, much quicker than the Greeks. Sometimes the Greeks developed other fields which were not developed in India because they were not interested in them. So we have to understand all these differences, and then we can begin to feel at least how these knowledge systems were an integral part of this Indian worldview. Indian worldview is something very difficult to define because it's very complex, it's fluid, it evolves in time. So we're not trying to be, to give a narrow blinkered definition of that. But you realize when you study one field that actually many other fields are already there. What we call today multidisciplinarity is nothing new at all. And you find ancient mathematicians who were also philosophers.
That's right. Yeah.
They were experts in one of the schools of philosophy, for example. They were poets,
Yes.
great masters of language. They were first-rate experts in pedagogy. They were trying to develop interesting pedagogies. You have someone like, the prime example is Bhaskaracharya in the 12th century CE. Who keeps being so concerned with how to make things uninteresting, attractive for the students, how to make mathematics interesting, and he composes poems and all this Leelavati work, for example. So we see that it's all together, and you find that there is, let's say, Kautilya Arthashastra, there is economics, there is polity, there is a lot of culture, there is there's sociology, there is of course governance and administration, and so many living parts of the society. So you have to keep branching out, and this is how slowly you develop a more integral perspective. So the spirit is as important as the data. What we really want the students, or let's say young people or even not so young, to understand about ancient India is really the ancient mind, how it worked and how it viewed the world, of course, the cosmos, the society, but how it kept playing in a very flexible way, very adaptable way, with new concepts, with not being dogmatic about. And especially not being dogmatic about the past. We find, for example, mathematicians who express very clearly the fact that, or astronomers, that the ancient texts, for example, Nilakantha Somayaji of the Kerala School of Mathematics in the 16th century, I think, speaks about the old texts, so from Aryabhata onward, the old Siddhantas. And he says, they created formulas, and but we should not be bound by them, because we see that in the course of time, the formulas no longer work quite well to predict the path of the planets or the sun and moon, etc. And we have to refine, retune the formulas, introduce corrective elements, and so on. So there was very, very little dogmatism. And what's I think should be very interesting for a historian of ideas, because ultimately this is where we drive towards. It's the history of ideas, more than simply, singing the glories of ancient India. It's how India contributed to that history, and we find that there is a very, very rich tradition of dialogue and debate, very rich. Yeah. And there was no limitation. We know how in Europe, the church did stifle for quite a while free thinking among scientists, for example. I mean, this is a well-known story. I don't have to tell it. This never existed in India. There was never, religious authority or a ruler telling intellectuals that they should not go in this direction, they should go in that direction. This never existed. And this tradition of debate among, people who had very, very different doctrines sometimes. So there are, in the spiritual field, there are certain very well-known traditions. But in the scientific, technical fields, there were also lots of, so we find the scientists dialoguing sometimes in a contemporary context, but they're very often across the centuries through the tradition of Bhashya, the commentaries.
Right.
So this whole working of the Indian intellect, the Indian mind, and how it ends up creating so much in this context of freedom is something fascinating for me, which I would like that we can convey to some extent to young Indians, because I found them responsive on this, that to discover that there's such a long, rich intellectual tradition, which was not dogmatic and which was always open to discussion and debate, then this is something that deserves respect at least.
Thank you. I think there's something very important that you say here, that the intellectual traditions of India, we may call them knowledge systems, really they're broad intellectual traditions which haven't received adequate attention, either from, broadly speaking, the academic institutions in India, if we want to call them that, or from, broadly speaking, the general public. I want to ask you this, Professor Danino, and this is something that I have been curious about myself, because I went from having a training in the Indian context to a PhD in the American academy. I want to ask you what you think about the kind of work that was done in the Euro-American Academy, particularly from fields like Indology, broadly speaking, religious studies, where this understanding that you could have a deep engagement with ideas, with intellectual traditions, with spiritual traditions, but you've mentioned that other places as well, and here that we cannot really separate out the material and the spiritual in these texts, right? So how do we then think about these other traditions of scholarship, and then, maybe they're somewhat ambiguous reception in the Indian context, so to speak, right?
It's a very complex question and not easy to answer. But first of all, we have to respect scholarship whenever it has been honest in its approach, sincere, and there have been large numbers of very sincere Western Indologists, right from the 18th century onward.
Right.
And they've contributed enormously. There's no doubt, no question about it. But of course, they were also the product of their time. Yes. They functioned in a certain cultural context, which was not always easy for them to detach themselves from. A few tried to, but I'm not saying that they were necessarily convinced of the superiority of European or Western thought. Not all were. But even if they were deeply respectful, even sometimes admiring of the accomplishments of Indian civilization, they were still, the way they thought and the way they were trying to conceive things was still a certain Western cultural framework of thinking. And that necessarily would impose limitations, and this is not just the case with India, but if you were to study ancient Chinese civilization, you would encounter the very same difficulty. That doesn't mean that you would have to trust only an Indian scholar. That is not correct. First of all, because they have brought a lot of fresh insights and sometimes fresh data, of course, but also because the Indian scholars themselves, they are caught in between several worlds. So there is traditional scholarship in India, which of course has been very diminishing, but still exists.
Yes,
we were lucky to meet great Ayurvedic practitioners, for example, in Kerala, and they were really in the traditional line. They were not the products of the modern Ayurveda colleges, which are actually something in between. They are imitative of the medical colleges, and Ayurveda was never something meant to be taught in a college of medicine. So they are compromises, but we are lucky to meet people in this traditional, intellectual lineage, and then to see how they function so differently. And we were lucky to meet also, scholars in the Vedic line, and that also was very revealing, because it was like, you still have something living today, which was generated thousands of years ago. This is in fact one difficulty that Western scholars had, at least at the beginning, that they were used to dealing with dead civilizations, the Greek and the Roman and the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian and all that. And you deal with a dead object differently from you deal with. You don't dissect a living object the same way as you dissect a dead object. So first of all, understanding that this civilization was still alive, of course, having gone through any number of changes and transformations, no doubt, was one challenge for them. Now in India we have the same thing, because our institutions are very much, after all, the product of Western education in their conception, structure. Though we say often, we hear that we have to go back to Nalanda, this, that. Well, it's easier said than done. The fact is that our institutions very well replicate the Western frameworks, and when you want to bring in this ancient perspective, I won't say traditional, but understanding the accomplishments of ancient Indian civilization, what approach do you take? So do you adopt the Western frameworks? Do you try to adopt some of the orthodox frameworks, still going back to the traditional scholars in those fields, or traditional practitioners often? So it has to be a kind of a mix and compromise of both. You cannot exclude modern scholarship. You have to understand its approaches and also its limitations. And you find that it can deepen our understanding. So looking at, you see, it's this whole anthropological dichotomy of emic versus ethic.
Yes.
We're all familiar with that. But so inside, to put it in ordinary language, the insider's perspective versus the outsider's perspective. Actually, I would say we need both. Because sometimes seeing something from outside, if I look at this object from outside, I may have a global view, which will not be as intimate as plunging in the water, diving in it, and understanding things from inside. So we need ideally both. And of course, it's not something that you can do in a short course, or even if it's a full-fledged four-year course, you can't easily bring that. But you can bring glimpses, and you can once in a while, have the peeps into the functionings of this civilization, how it has really differed, how it has innovated, and be wary of the frameworks that were developed for Western societies, are imported and applied unthinkingly to Indian society or Indian knowledge systems and so on. Because very often there's a mismatch, and people don't even realize it. So you import, structuralism, or you import postmodernism, or you import, all these models that we keep dealing with in humanity. So you import Foucault and Derrida or whatnot, and we keep hearing these names, French names as it happens.
And you shared the first name with one of them.
So you keep importing these names, and I'm not saying that they cannot throw some interesting light, but you have to understand that they have to be handled with care. And there is very often, I've seen in Indian academia, there's a lack of clarity. There's also a subconscious desire to emulate Western scholarship, to be acceptable to Western scholarship, and it's a very difficult exercise. I don't know if I would want to. Actually, I didn't have a career in academics. I was pulled into it almost forcibly. So that was an advantage. So therefore, it's a balancing act at the end of the day. But what someone like Sri Aurobindo, if I may go back to him, said, and he's not the only one. I think Tagore said something very similar, is that you have to know the world. You have to be open to all thoughts from all sides, but you have to have your feet on your ground. You have to have your roots. So you have to understand where you come from. You have to understand, what the civilization has contributed, whether it's good or bad, or whether it's whatever it may be. But you know that you belong to that stream of civilization, and having your foundation there, then you can easily look at everything and absorb whatever you want.
Right.
So what they were objecting to was the uprooted, the uprootment that they saw happening during the colonial time. And you may remember Anand Kumaraswamy, for example, calling students going through British education, he called them the victims of Indian education, because he lamented that he said, in just a couple of generations we have seen the kind of ravage that this created in their minds, the complete uprootment of so he was writing this around, I think, 1920 or something like that. But Sri Aurobindo, Tagore, Vivekananda, and quite a few others said very similar things. So it's the whole problem of, where do we stand? Many colonized nations have had to face the same issue. What do we do now?
Yes.
How do we decolonize? Decolonization doesn't mean simple blind rejection of everything, and you can't even do it.
Yes.
Even if you wanted to.
Yes.
So decolonization means really rediscovering those roots and what was good and enriching in that. And God knows India has quite a bit in that sense. And then rebuilding your worldview. But you can't go back. It's not about going back. You can never go back. But you can bring the past, which is still alive in some ways, and then, enrich yourself with it and create something new.
That's great. I wanted to ask you a little bit, when you're talking about Indian knowledge systems and our, a civilizational recovery, so to speak, not to go back into, the times that these texts may have been written in, but to sort of think about our present in a broader civilizational context. I think as an idea, it's a fantastic idea, and there is much to be worked towards it in many ways. I would be so when we think about India, we naturally think about its diversity. We think about, people who may not have been a part of several of these great civilizational texts that we are talking about, or who may not directly have been a part of the worlds that these civilizational texts
or who may not know that they were a part.
Or we may not know that they were a part. Absolutely. You're very right about that. But when we think broadly speaking, and then we think, of course, about the very important presence, culturally speaking, I don't know civilizationally how would you talk about it, but culturally speaking, of the Indo-Persian centuries of Indian past, right? I would really love to hear your thoughts about how that works into this larger civilizational logic, because in my understanding, I don't think we can also close off a civilizational logic.
So Indo-Persian, are you going back to the Vedic or pre-Vedic times, or are you limiting yourself to the...
No, so of course you can talk about Indo-Persian all the way, of course, because of language and the parallels in language.
But you are referring,
I'm very happy to have you go all the way back, but I would like to know what you would think about, the so-called Muslim conquest period of India. So,
Well, again, we are usually limited to some streams of thought that actually oversimplify things. And no phenomenon is on such a scale can be so simple. So first of all, we have to understand that it is something complex, which happened, of course, over centuries altogether, because it was Indo-Afghan, it was Indo-this, Indo-that, and finally Indo-Persian. And we have to understand that these phenomena which usually start with the military aspect, can have a very brutal face. And It's undeniable to me, having studied, I'm not an expert in medieval history of India, but from what I have seen, as objectively as possible, the destructive part of it is undeniable, and certainly impacted India very deeply, and caused a kind of a contraction in the society in many ways. So this is one aspect which cannot be denied, and I was yesterday mentioning it about this whole Ayodhya story, that it's better to accept the facts, even if they are part of dark chapters of history, rather than try to pretend that they did not exist, because you can deal with them in a much more wholesome manner. But then there will also be, with this, and this is all over the world, there will also be cultural interchange happening. And there will be sometimes, it can sometimes happen that the conqueror is conquered in another way. It happened with the Kushanas, for example.
Right.
So they came typically as military conquerors in India, but they were culturally conquered by Buddhism. What we call Buddhism. For them it might have been a little bit different, but let us say. So this is quite clear. As far as Indo-Persian more particularly is concerned, there's no doubt that there was some mutual enrichment. And we can take an icon like Darashikoh, for example, as an ideal model of what could have been a very healthy, enriching interchange, and it did happen to some extent. It was also stifled by reactionist, ultra-orthodox views, no doubt about it. He himself suffered from this, undeniably. But ultimately, the amount of cultural interchange was very substantial. The way so many pieces of Indian literature, from the Panchatantra to the epics and so on, traveled through that channel was very important. So, it's something. There were also exchanges at the scientific level, mathematics, astronomy, again, medicine, and so on. So all this needs to be studied, in a fairly comprehensive manner, without sweeping anything under the carpet. So when people say, the destruction has been greatly exaggerated and so on, well, you have to study it before you can pass a judgment. And there's enough material now to be clear about what happened. Ultimately, also, it has to be understood that the Mughals were not like the British, for example.
Right. Which is also a claim often made, that there was no difference between the colonization of the British and the pre-British.
Each colonization is has a story of its own. You can't have one framework for all of them. Not at all. And ultimately, the Mughal rule itself went through ups and downs. So we have Akbar, and then later on we have Aurangzeb, and so on, and they were not at all the same voices. So this cannot be reduced to a very short, simple, narrow narrative, and we have to take enough pains to understand all the aspects.
Thank you. I will come to what will hopefully be the last discussion point that we have before we wrap up this this interaction. I want to know a little bit more about how you feel about how we should communicate these extremely complex ideas that we have been talking about over here. And over again, what I've heard you say is the importance of nuance, the importance of looking at different kinds of perspectives, studying each one, trying to see what is it that you want to agree with, being clear about what is it that you are studying and what your questions are and how you go to different kinds of perspectives, not sweeping things under the carpet. There are some very nuanced, very layered sort of arguments and propositions that I've put here on the table. I really want to know how to translate it for my 12-year-old.
Precisely that's the question, that
Right.
you know, at what age do you mean?
Yes.
So
yes.
if it is 12-year-old, it's almost the age that we were dealing with when we were preparing this textbook for class 6, which came out in July for the current year, little bit belatedly. And we were constantly asking ourselves this question, because you don't deal with the 12-year-old as you deal with the postgraduate student.
Exactly, yes.
So at that level, you can only present certain facts and in a simple way, and invite the child actually to reflect upon. It's more about asking questions. It's not about you know, trying to impart knowledge. Yes, you can use some illustrative facts, you can use, and we've tried to do it in the textbook. You can use some interesting nugget, you can use some figure of the past. But basically what you want the child to feel is something about that worldview, about the values, about you know, what preoccupied people. But you have to keep it at ground level in a very simple manner. Actually, even at a higher level, I found in my own teaching at IIT Gandhinagar that what worked much better was not to start from the philosophical foundations, which some people are tempted to do. So we will first study all the great philosophies of India, and then we will you know, come to some of the offshoots. And so I try to do it the other way around. I would usually start from, for example, obvious technologies. You start from, say, water structures. But in water structures, art comes in, sometimes spectacularly. So why? Why do they have to integrate art in water structures? Why do they have to create sometimes hundreds of statues in a step well? What is this compulsive need? Why also do they design things in a way that the society will be benefited equally? You know, you find you have a lot of social discussion that you can conduct around water structures. You can also integrate, of course, science, technology, the understanding of the environment, understanding of the climate, the monsoons, and so on and so forth. So you take one such you know, item, artifact, for example, and you build a whole narrative around it. And this is something, because it starts from something tangible, visible, and you move towards the intangible rather than the other way around, which to me works well. Pedagogically, at least this has been my experience. And of course, at school level, the National Education Policy also speaks of going from the known to the unknown. And it's nothing new. It's been with, you know, education is for decades. So I think that this is what should be done. Or start with, you know, again, a poem of Leelavati on you know, how many pearls were on the necklace of the princess after it broke down and the pearls scattered and so on. And then this is something very puzzling and amusing, which can keep the students engaged. Basically, it's really about not trying to be comprehensive, not trying to be thorough, picking a few things and actually building around them, and you know, the dots end up connecting themselves. So you do need a bit of time and space, but because everything is multidisciplinary. So you take even music, for example, classical Indian music, for example. Well, there's a lot of mathematics in it. So that is another possible line, and so on and so forth. So you take, for example, governance, all the texts we have about the duties, ethical duties of a ruler. And you initiate discussion. Is it real? Are there rulers who really reflect that value system? What about it? And so on. And do you compare this with the value system, for example, of kings in medieval France and so on? And you can have lots of interesting discussions. So it's a mix of pedagogies, but keeping things as concrete and engaging as possible.
Right.
There's, we are actually, in a way, we are only beginning. And I don't know if it should be called part of this effort of decolonization. Maybe it's one step on the way. Today, lots of people speak about IKS in India. Indian knowledge system is becoming very fashionable. But at the same time, there is not enough patient work to really go to the foundations, understand all the thinking that went into them, and simply, listing out facts and expecting the students to learn them by heart is not going to help. It would rather be off-putting at the end of the day.
Right.
So it's more, it's always the same philosophy of pedagogy which works. Getting the student to enter this by engaging him or her and actually stimulating reflections, discussions, and so on. And this is a new direction altogether.
That's great. I just wanted to comment a little bit on that by saying, when I was going through my school system, and I grew up in Rajasthan, and my school had a state board system. I recall very clearly that the place where anything akin to, broadly speaking, Indian knowledge systems would be introduced would be in language and literature courses. Right? So this is a very, your history textbooks were not really covering, because history was too concerned with, empiricism and putting things in chronology and things like that. But it was the language and literature textbooks that really opened up this completely different world of thinking. And I remember, because I was reading Tulsidas's poems in my grade 10th, or I was reading Kabir's poetry in grade 10th, how that opened up a very different world for me. Not just, a very different way of thinking about my own mother tongue, which was Hindi, which is Hindi, but also how to think about how people put ideas in words. So I just thought that's an interesting observation.
And it's very good. You were lucky, maybe. I don't know if it's still the case in today's schools, but this is definitely one way of opening the student to this world. But it should not be limited to those fields.
Right.
Because then we are also giving a subtle message that, Indian knowledge was only concerned with spirituality, literature, etc. It was concerned with all fields.
Right.
So therefore, it should be integrated also in engineering courses whenever relevant. It should be integrated in mathematics. It should be integrated in governance, democracy, in economics. And actually, there are people who are trying today, sometimes a bit clumsily perhaps, but there are many attempts to do this. I see a lot of so-called management courses claiming to use Arthashastra and so on. So there are attempts. It will take some time to settle down.
Right.
But, the bottom line is that these knowledge systems are not limited to the past. They are still relevant today. They can still give us very important messages. Sometimes people have developed new water structures with some ancient idea. Sometimes one mathematician got inspired by an ancient process, not by its result, which was perhaps very basic, but by the way, the approach. So governance, we can go back to the duties of the dharma of the ruler, etc. So showing that these knowledge systems are of relevance, are still able to perhaps help us move towards answers to the huge challenges that humanity is going to face in these very difficult times. We should, ideally speak about India's environmental traditions, which are becoming increasingly relevant again. So this is what needs to be done, and it's not something that can be done overnight. It will take years for this reintegration of Indian knowledge. And again, it's not about just repeating something that was done in the past. It has to be reformulated and reshaped almost for the contemporary world.
Right. Okay. Last thing that I want to I want to go back to the fact that you began your journey in Auroville and now you're in Gandhinagar. And these are really two very great thinkers of 20th century India, amazing personalities. Has that meant something to you, the fact that you're now living in a city of Gandhi?
Well, it was incidental, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's just that I was dragged to this particular institute by a visionary director, Professor Sudhir Jain,
I see.
who really pulled me almost forcibly at some point. But I was, of course, a willing, participant in the process. That was not. I've tried to study all the great minds and great contributors of India in the little bit in the 19th, but mostly in the 20th century, and there are such great figures. So this has been part of my journey, and I would like to have more time to study all of them, but then there's only so much you can do in a lifetime. So
yeah. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. My pleasure too. Thank you very much.